Welcome back to the HTLP, the Holistic Teaching and Learning Podcast. I'm Jalissa, and this is a show that introduces approaches to holistic teaching and its impact on students. In today's episode, we chat with aspiring educator and social justice advocate from UCLA, Jonathan Oyaga. Jonathan is the president of the Student SCTA and a leader in the National Education Association. We discuss California's new investment in community schools. On May 18th of 2022, it was announced that the California State Board of Education granted $4.1 billion to the pilot of community schools, where families, educators, and students' well-being is priority of the public education infrastructure to ensure that students are at the center of learning. Before we get into our discussion, I invite you to join me in a moment of reflection. Recall for a moment what made kindergarten through high school so magical. If you had an unlimited amount of money and resources to build your dream school, what would it look like? What would the classes look like? What would the lunches look like? What are the teachers like? Now would be the time to pause this episode and reflect on the prompt. We would love to hear your response. If you're willing, you can send your dream school idea to us at htlconference@sou.edu, which can be found in the description. I'll now be introducing my co-host and mentor, Dr. Robin Martin.
All right. Hi, Jonathan. It's nice to be here with you today. Yeah, I guess I'm from Iowa originally, if you know where that is. And I did my doctorate about 20 years ago at Iowa State University, but I came to California to do it because I studied a small holistic school in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada mountains, well, the foothills, I guess. And 5 or 6 years of my life, I really dedicated to learning about independent holistic models of education and progressive schools that were doing things differently. A lot of them were outside of the public domain, but not always. I traveled around to different states and got to visit schools and things. And then for 15 years, I've been out of the country, and I just came back about a year ago, and I've been working at Southern Oregon University ever since, and I'm delighted to be part of what Jalissa calls the HTLC, the Holistic Teaching and Learning, and then C is kind of up for grabs what that means.
Awesome. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Well, hi, I'm Jonathan, and I am now a senior at UCLA out here in SoCal. I grew up in South Pasadena and grew up also in the Pasadena area with my grandparents. So I got to see a very two different sides of public education. On one end, I grew up in a very predominantly wealthy environment with a really good school district. But when I hung out with my grandparents, I hung out with their neighbors and their neighbors' children who went to low income schools, right? And I didn't realize this kind of stark contrast in public education funding until halfway through high school. And I was like, okay, this is kind of upsetting. And then this kind of was what drove my passion and pride for education and why I really want to end up becoming a teacher. Because first I was just I want to work in education in general, make it better. But then when I worked with special education students as a learning lab assistant, I had a lot of fun. It was probably one of the first times where I felt an environment where you could just be, right, without judgment. And I told myself we need more spaces like this, not just for special education students, but everyone, right, in general. A classroom where you don't have to worry. And I was a student teacher there, trying to help them out, and I felt free. So that's where I was okay, we need to replicate this elsewhere. So I attended Pasadena City College, and I was actually going to major in psychology when UCLA opened up its education and social transformation major. And I had to apply. I thank God and that I didn't go to school straight out of high school and went to community college first, because if not, I don't know what my major would be right now. But if it wasn't for community college and then now where I am at UCLA, I wouldn't have been exposed to community schools, right?
What got you into then joining the CTA?
And that's one of the funny things, because it was in community college when I first joined CTA NEA, right? The California Teachers Association and the National Education Association. It was because I thought it was just a club on campus, and it was during COVID. So I was like, this is a way to socialize online, even though I'm kind of stuck. And the way I got sucked into it, I say, uh, is because a friend that I made at an internship just hit me up and asked, "Do you want to hang out on a Zoom meeting and like just talk about school?" Right. And I was like, "This is cool. Nerds like me want to talk about school." Uh, so that was great. And I then got into like statewide leadership from there, national leadership, and it was just because of a simple conversation. And it was that memory that drove me to join the union of I lived in a very great school district, but 5 minutes away because it's red line. Like there's literally a freeway right there. You see it. But yeah, they didn't have a soccer field. They didn't have like well-trained teachers. They were understaffed all the way around. And I was just like, this is so confusing to me, right? And it was through the power of the union where I realized like I could really speak up and advocate for these issues, right? And now I find myself the president of Student CTA. And that is a whole experience in itself because I would never think that I've just never imagined myself being in a position like this. A lot of people do things because it's like it'll look good on your resume or something. But I reflect back every day and I thank God because it's like this is the space where I can actually use my voice and someone's going to hear me because I'm mad, but I want to be a teacher. So when I started thinking about education and actually joining the profession, like there's a lot of things that I want to see change, right? But I saw that better to do that as an educator and through my union than becoming some kind of like politician or policy worker. Because working with students is going to give you the actual experience that you need to then work and help make sure students are getting properly educated. And that's why I love community schools because in my head, when I was like, how can we fix this problem 5 minutes away? Like students aren't coming to school because they don't have clean clothes or they don't have clothes to wear to school, right? They don't have access to uniform, food. They don't have access to Wi-Fi, electricity, all this stuff. I'm like, isn't the school supposed to do this? So it just pissed me off. And I thought in my head, like, school should be the center for the community to just come and do their thing. Because after all, it's us who's paying for it, right? And I thought I was crazy. And then I learned that this has a name for it already. It's called community schools. So I was like, okay, good. I'm going to sit down. I don't have to go out there and invent something. Because I was going to do research and try and do that, big head thinking. But then the fact that there's already a movement for this kind of work is what then got me excited to jump into this kind of work, which is why I thank God for UCLA and its education and social transformation major, because then that is what further got me into studying and researching community schools and the different aspects to it and how it can actually really benefit a community. And that's where I'm like, okay, it's working. Like all of the schools that you see around are working, and that's because of how there's a bottom up holistic approach to educating the students, right? It's really great to see communities thriving, right? And we see that a lot of what drives this thriving is what kind of wealth is in community and what already exists, what barriers and what institutional racism is doing in that community, right? And there's a lot of things that tie into education itself that we don't realize it or we choose to not realize that can do a lot to really educate the child, but then also make the community grow as a whole. And that will tackle more than just not being educated correctly, but also like poverty and violence and so forth. So community schools can be a space for social transformation, for community transformation. They're possible. Like it's not something like some wild dream. And I'll talk about it a little bit more as we kind of progress through the conversation, but about like the different funding that's coming into it, the different supporters and partnerships that are going on across the country to really make sure that community schools aren't just a thing happening in California, but they're happening everywhere else, right? And that soon, hopefully, every school becomes a community school.
This is so inspiring, and I find it important that you mention the institutional and systemic racism embedded in public education. The rise of community schools calls on teachers and teacher prep programs to revisit what we should be doing in schools and maybe reframing what the purpose of education is. I find the support of community schools to be almost the first step in a much needed education reform. I mean, instead of asking families to pay thousands of dollars for a quote unquote good K-12 education in private schools, because we know that there are so many families who don't have the funds and access to this quote unquote good education. But really what it is a call on our government to support the system of public education that we already have.
Right.
Anyways, I saw on your student CTA Instagram that you all had your board kickoff. Congratulations. How was this process for you?
Yeah. So I'm gonna be honest, nervous, super nervous, but that's just because it's like the last year as vice president, it was a lot of like trying to figure things out. And then now I know how to do that, like the logistics, right? Jumping through hoops and all that stuff, right? But what I was mostly just nervous about was just like kind of how do we bring a group of people together and then really try and get all of the voices out there on the table, right? Let's hear the concerns and then let's get to know each other. And then from there, really build that solidarity that we need to lead a movement for a better public education led by aspiring educators, right? Because that's my goal right there when it comes to really elevating the aspiring ed voice to make sure that we're included, if not being the driving force in the change we need to see in our public education system. Now, I was nervous because I was like, I want to hear everyone else, but we don't have enough time. And wanted to jam in so much, but that's where I continue to learn that there's always more time to continue building and also other spaces to continue the conversation. But overall, it was very exciting because it's really great to be in a space with aspiring educators who want to get involved, are trying to learn how to get involved, but most importantly, are passionate about the students that they want to work with, whether that's K through 12 or higher education. It was really great to see a room of diverse aspiring educators, all at different stages in their lives and their educational journeys, but they're all coming into the classroom right now at a time when entering the classroom doesn't really seem that appetizing. And it's great because we don't have to be in this space. We don't have to be a part of the union or part of the statewide board. But because we choose to, there's this energy of organizing and wanting to continue learning that's really great when it comes to like thinking about the future. It's knowing that the future, like the future of public education is in great hands. We just need to continue learning and organizing. So the kickoff went really great, really excited for the work that we have ahead, especially in our next meeting when we expand our board and filling a couple of vacancies and so forth. But it's great to see a year, especially in a year like this one, where things are coming back in person, kind of like 100%, but there's still that hybrid option or whatnot, that there's going to be a lot more ways for aspiring educators to get involved in California, but also just with like the current climate of public education and just like we have a midterm election coming up and elections matter. We all know that. And I'll talk about that later when we kind of talk about infrastructure stuff like funding community schools. But yeah, it's going to be a really exciting year. I'm also like, how am I going to do this while also doing my senior year and my capstone and my community engagement courses and all that stuff? We're going to make it through though. We always do. But it's an exciting year ahead, definitely.
Just a question about your senior year. Do you also do the licensure for the state of California to become a teacher during your senior year?
So this is the part of California where I'm like, at some point we'll get to this. California, from my understanding, has like the California higher ed plan. So it's like you have community college, you have your Cal States, or you have your University of Californias, right? The Cal States tend to be more of the technical and how-to schools. So that's the school where you would go to get your bachelor's degree and at the same time complete your credentialing program. But at the UCs, because especially because UCLA is like one of the first to have such a program, right now it's just the bachelor's, where we do a lot of the why thinkings. And that's why I chose UCLA over Cal State, because I wanted to do more thinking of like why we actually do the things that we do. What I would then, my next steps be are seek out my master's and my credential. And that's hopefully next year, if not a gap year. But if I do a gap year, I'm going to do substitute teaching so I could just get into the classroom because I don't want to wait. Because right now there's all these emergency credentials, but also ways to still get involved in the classroom, like a teacher's assistant, so forth. And that's for me where it's like, I don't want to stop. I just want to keep now this time even more, just get into the classroom, right? So yeah, 2 more years after this last year, and then we're hopefully in the classroom as a teacher.
All right. Good luck with all of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, if you don't mind just giving us a little history of community schools and what brought this team to start this project, which ended up bringing in this huge funding opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm no like community schools expert, just go and put that disclaimer out first. But a lot of my knowledge and involvement comes from my studies at UCLA, but also just diving into community advocacy efforts. Community schools emerged from this idea that schools should be centers for social transformation based on a lot of holistic ideas of how do we educate the child. So when I think back to like my studies, I think of Bronfenbrenner, Montessori, these different theories and ideas that we should educate the whole child. But then we also fast forward to the present moment and we have done a lot of unearthing in American history. And we recognize that there's a responsibility for our education systems to teach the truth, but also be centers for democracy, democracy and social justice. So we have different frameworks, that different pillars, so to say, that define a community school. But community schools don't necessarily have like a set definition. And that's kind of what I would say makes community schools a little confusing, but also at the same time, not confusing at all. Because a lot of what the pillars talk about, regardless of whether you're using NEA's 6 pillars, or I believe UCLA's 5, or the Learning Policy Institute's 4 pillars, they all center on basic tenets. And I'll focus on the NEA ones because these are the ones that I kind of look up to. And it's 1, strong and proven curriculum; 2, high quality teaching; 3, inclusive leadership; 4, positive behavior practices; 5, family and community partnerships; and 6, community support services. So all of that really is focused around that one specific community. I had the opportunity of studying and visiting the UCLA's pilot school called the Robert F. Kennedy Community School. And it's located in Koreatown in this historic hotel where Robert F. Kennedy was actually assassinated. And that's why the school is named after him, and also in honor of his allyship and his co-conspiratorship in the Chicano movement and so forth, especially because Koreatown is predominantly Latinx, Middle Eastern, Asian. It's also very low income and impoverished. So what we saw in this school was a community where the school was very close by, but parents in the community were sending their students out to charter schools and private schools because RFK couldn't offer a quality education. And what we saw in the studies was that because of how gentrification was blowing up and these schools were offering incentives to go and actually had a great education system, families were leaving the school district and the school was about to close. But what UCLA said was, let's talk about our community school framework and let's see what we can do in this community to transform the school, but transform the community itself. So they brought together any stakeholder of this school, and that involved the Teachers Union, United Teachers Los Angeles, LAUSD, LA Unified School District, and then the community itself. And this is a process for pretty much any community school. You ask what is going on, why aren't people going to school, what is preventing people from going to school, right? And what they found was that because the school itself wasn't providing nutritional assistance, after school programs, and because the transportation to get there was unsafe, families were choosing the other options because they provided buses, food, nutrition, all that stuff. But what were they doing? They were paying for it, or they were suffering the consequences of having to figure out how to send students right to other campuses that are far off. And this only kind of further perpetuates the cycle of poverty that we find in these communities because they're always living paycheck to paycheck or in debt, trying to get an education, which we know is what's going to propel students forward and get them out of the cycle of poverty. But furthermore, what this school found was that students weren't applying to graduate or weren't completing graduation or weren't applying to schools. So in partnership with LAUSD and UTLA, they really coordinated on how do we invest into this school to be a service for the community. What they did then was provide supplemental nutrition services, after school program services, as well as a legal clinic for students who were part of or were themselves in mixed status families. So they were undocumented or someone in their family was undocumented, which is another driving factor in this community that didn't send students to school. They were scared that when they went to school, they would come home and their parents weren't there. So they set up a legal clinic to not only help the students, but also as a safe space for undocumented students and their families to really seek aid. And what we also see in schools like this is that instead of having police officers on campus, making sure that campus is safe, they're making sure that the perimeter itself is safe, where the community came together and heard that the police don't make students feel safe. When they see police, they think, are my parents going to get deported if they drop me off at school? Then it's the same way with the after school program. When the families are working 2 to 3 jobs every day and they're able to stay on campus and continue to learn with the Wi-Fi and the resources that they need, technology that they need to actually then do that work. Because we all have now computers, iPads, all that stuff, because it's a new age where technology is used in education, but not every student has that privilege. And having a school site that really offered that assistance really allowed for students to then become engaged. So what this school saw was increased enrollment after this period where they started implementing these services. And what really happened was more students applying, more were graduating, and even more were applying to colleges. And that's one of the great things that UCLA, for example, is that a lot of the partnerships that they had there then linked to UCLA, right? So students were then going to UCLA because of their connection with the school and how the school's really working to increase the opportunities that students have to succeed in the classroom. So that's just one school site where you really see how all of these wraparound services really kick in to help the community. It's like, wow, like they really were able to transform not only the students and the community itself, but just this idea of education and how it should work.
Yeah, before you go on, I want to ask a little bit more about RFK because and what I was thinking in my mind too is what about the particular leaders? Like, were there particular leaders that were really advocating for the transformation process into a community school? And how did that affect the teaching staff? And did the teaching staff, were they coached in a certain way to change the curricular approach that they were using in the school? I mean, what were the changes that were happening at the, I guess at the staff level of administration and teachers too, if you have that information?
Right. Yeah. So I don't have all of it, but I do have some really great insights into how like curriculum and that stuff is kind of built up. So when a school is transitioning into a community school or becoming a community school, right, you meet with your fellow educators to talk about school. You're talking about curriculum, sharing ideas, discussing what works and what doesn't work when it comes to educating students. But at the same time, you're talking about this in this specific classroom, not in a teacher education program where you're learning a kind of template for this and then you're just thrown in there like, okay, find out that it doesn't work because we know it doesn't. This is just the state standards. And so they're being brought into a community of educators to discuss curriculum, but also discuss really what are the supports that I need. And that's where like high quality teaching comes in. These are the spaces where you are talking about what professional development do I actually need, not what does the district think I need based on the last complaint that happened or something like that. And that's where then the pillar of inclusive leadership comes in, because administrators, superintendents, directors on the board of directors are being involved in these conversations so that they can see the work that educators should be doing, because we know that these higher ups sometimes have never been in the classroom, or this is a jumpstart on their political careers. and they've never been in a classroom. So they don't know what teachers need. They don't know what students need. But because we're now creating a space where we're saying, hey, come, like, let's talk about this. That's where they can really also discuss the things where it's like, we want to do this, but we don't have the funding for it, and really push for things that are needed for the classroom. So it's bringing in these folks, and there's probably a more kind of like structured way when it comes to doing this that I'm not aware of, but it all starts with the idea of having a conversation. One of the things that Susan Miller Dorsey High School does is that they have that weekly meeting, right, with the educators, but they also have the students come to that. And it's funny because I realize I do this at the end of every day in one of my classes. It's like an exit slip, but I do it every week, discussing what can be done to make the campus better, the educational experience better, because we're actively wanting to work for the students, because it makes school more relevant. It makes school fun. And when I say that, I think of like ethnic studies and STEM and how all of that can come together, right? School should be, and education should be a liberating experience. But we see, at least my educational experience, where we see a lot of like base, Eurocentric, more hiding the hidden history of America. We don't really talk about that, right? We exclude BIPOC, LGBTQ plus, and disabled folks. And in this history, where we now have a more diverse population of students that don't see themselves in history. But then you talk about the curriculum, see how we can kind of engage different aspects of life, social justice, awareness, social issues, acceptance, tolerance, all that into these math lessons, science lessons, English lessons, history lessons, where you then have students wanting to come to class. And that's another thing, right? If students don't feel valued, what is their inclination to go, right? So yeah, in kind of like in a summary for how is staff involved, it's like bringing the community together, right? Bringing the community of educators on campus, from counselors to educators from across the disciplines, to really just talk about how can we make the educational experience better, what strategies worked, what didn't work, and also what can be done on campus or in the classroom to improve the experience for the students.
You talk about education as this liberating experience by engaging with different social justice and awareness aspects within the curriculum. We just had an interview with someone and we asked, how do you implement social justice in education without trying to indoctrinate or push on this rather progressive view that we're seeing right now is getting a lot of pushback in news and media, when in reality, all that's happening is education and education. But in this recent interview we had, they gave us this beautiful example of doing without doing. So this teacher would take their students to a field in nature, knowing that in the near future, it was all going to be devastated for like a shopping mall or road infrastructure. So they brought this same group of students back to this field, and all that they saw was a clear cut. All the natural, beautiful things that they witnessed not so long ago was all gone. And by doing this, their students were able to see and feel like there's something wrong here. And in their own way, they were able to understand what environmental justice was. But sometimes this could be scary with our current political climate to sneak in different exposures to advocacy efforts, right?
Right. Yeah, no, and I love that example was used, right? Because it's kind of seeing it, but when you think of community schools right now, like RFK, they're living it, right? And our institutional systems, our educational systems really perpetuate this idea that we're stuck in it, when in reality, there's so much more that our government and our communities can do to really support and uplift education. There's just always the excuse that it costs too much, or that there's not enough for it. And when we think about social justice through education, yes, there's that pushback. We also have to understand that as educators and as aspiring educators, it's about starting to change the conversation, but also just the fact that teaching love is teaching with love, and teaching about love is honestly what this is all about, because we need social and racial justice. But when we learn to love each other as humans on this beautiful world instead of hate, then we're actually able to drive the social justice work without doing that kind of like progressive indoctrination, quote unquote, uh, that we are hearing a lot in the media.
That was beautifully expressed. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, how can established schools adopt this community school framework to receive funding, support, training, and all that is needed to pilot it?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a lot of things happening right now. And although I do not know the exact steps, I do know a lot of like information regarding like that funding and kind of like ways that at least NEA is stepping in to make sure that educators are really actively working towards that, right? Now, any school can be a community school and like call themselves that, but it's really important to like realize that a community school is a bottom up school. So wherever you go, it's really centering around what that community needs. And if that's not the focus isn't like what can we do to better serve the community so that this education site is a center for social transformation. If we're not doing that, then it's not a community school. Schools will go through the work of becoming community schools, but then abuse those funds, right? Administrators, gatekeepers, and politicians will then kind of hold on to that and use it for other things, right? I like to think flashy new sports stadiums instead of new classrooms and more higher teacher pay, things like that. Any school can become a community school, but it's really centered around the community and their needs and follows the similar frameworks, at least like NEAs. And right now, what we have is all this funding in California specifically. We have billions of dollars that are going into starting community schools, but we also see nationally through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan that there's all of this new money going to states for the purpose of education with specific items to fund community schools. And that's, I think, what makes community schools really exciting right now. But then how are we going to use it? You have the other side of this kind of argument. How are we going to responsibly handle this money? Or aren't we just giving away money at this point, right? That's where I really kind of like push back, because there's a lot of money that goes into a lot of places that if we just arguably spent it better, we would be able to fund 10 times over our current education system and still have everything that we want to save, like military and police and schools. So when it comes to applying or becoming a community school, right, your like school site has to apply for these monies, because to fund a community school, it takes a lot of not just community organizing and mobilization, but the funds, right, to produce it. UCLA is really unique because they're backing with their, big UCLA budget a lot of like that legal clinic. The legal clinic is run by UCLA students, all pro bono work done by UCLA students and faculty to improve the lives of the students, right? Helping those students gain access to citizenship or their families to citizenship, or to get a green card or some kind of protected status. That's work that is being funded and done by UCLA through the conversations that were first initially held. And that's kind of what goes back to what makes a community school is talking to that community, seeing what they need and so forth. Like when you see that a school is more than 50% on free or reduced lunch, then just give them all free lunch. Let's not even make this a conversation. Let's just go ahead and do it and not have to have that conversation of, oh, you owe $2.
How would school sites then be held accountable for not abusing this money?
That's where like NEA and CTA would step in, right? NEA has created this whole community schools institute so that state affiliates like CTA or like Oregon Education Association can apply to get these funds from NEA, using unions and locals as the sites to drive the conversation for correct method of community schools. Because what you have is all this money, like in California, I think it was $4 billion that's being invested right now over the course of several years. That means we need community school coordinators, we need principals, we need other administrators, right? But these folks at the same time can just grab this money and not do what we need to do. That's still top down. They're still going to be doing that top down approach. That's where the union really comes in to really work with the union locals to say, this is what a community school looks like, using the pillars, using our assets in NEA, CTA, of community school, like directors, researchers, policy workers, right? To really empower locals and educators to really do then that work. So if the educators themselves are advocating for XYZ, and then they're actually able to then do it, right? Because they're advocating for it and then also making sure that it's instituted within that community school. Like I bring up community schools and aspiring educator spaces a lot because it's simply knowing that you could be the person to start the conversation can then help you once you get there, right? Because I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon. Community schools have been around for a while, but now there's this new money, right? That's actually going to support the creation of these community schools. So this new energy around it can really be used to benefit students, right? But it could also be abused. And that's where programs the NEA has really is working to empower educators to take the action and the lead in organizing community schools and not just letting districts apply for that grant and then just kind of like going with the motions. Because community schools isn't about going with the motions. It's about going the extra mile to make sure the students are getting the resources that they need. That's the problem with us in this American institution, the way that we fund education is we don't want to go the extra mile. We don't want to go. We're just end up, I don't know how, doing the bare minimum, right? And that has to do with actually I do know how, like institutional racism, uh, and the way that things are really going into, do we want to invest in BIPOC communities? Obviously not, because we redline them into like low property value, and that's how we do it. And I think I always bring that up because in California we had Proposition 15 on the ballot, and it would have reassessed the value of properties that haven't been reassessed since like the 1970s, I believe, that are now worth millions of dollars, that we can't tax them at a proper rate. And it didn't pass, unfortunately, but like that would have included millions, if not more, into this public education funding and the way that schools in low income communities are actually funded. So kind of like wrapping that up with a nice little bow. Like always, because community schools don't have that like set definition, so to say, is that sense of community, right? That you really need to go back to before you start one. Because if you're starting a community school, so to say, in a community that doesn't really need those wraparound services that you see at like RFK, then, and I think of like wealthy school districts that are just going to build football fields and not actually invest into the community themselves. But then it's also those same school districts where you see they might actually need the support because they have a low BIPOC community that needs more support that their school is not offering.
And the more you examine our history of public education in the United States, the more you realize that there's a necessity to have a conversation about our system's notorious lack of representation, or it's even a complete misrepresentation that we should address. Our Center for Holistic Education here in Southern Oregon, I've always said, taps into this examination because teachers at their core are much more than their job description. For example, just because you're a math teacher doesn't mean your job is solely going to be teaching these students math for an hour and then bye-bye. No, like you said earlier, educators are engaging with these students for 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and are also witnessing the hardships that these young people are experiencing. In the lens of spiritual and deep holistic education, these teachers are not just teachers. They're emotional support resources, and sometimes they're the only stable adult relationship in these children's lives. We peeked at NEA's Community School Toolkit and were interested in this SWOT framework. SWOT standing for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats at a school. You mentioned earlier working with stakeholders. Have you been involved in this process before, and what was it like? And how do schools utilize it?
Yeah, so my final for my class on community schools at UCLA was actually a SWOT. And I got the opportunity to select the school site and conduct the SWOT for them, right? And that's when I choose Susan Miller Dorsey High School. And I went through everything. What were the wraparound services? What is the type of curriculum that they provide? And how do they go about it, right? We don't do SWATs in normal school districts. We just do, this is what you did, this is what you didn't do it better. That doesn't really have educators, administrators, students critically thinking about what can be done better to make this place where I spend all my time at better. And I say that sarcastically because it's just like at the end of the day, that's what students are thinking. Part of the reason why I want to be a teacher is because I feel like we wasted so much time because it's just this like strict mode of thinking that you have to do, where at least I only enjoyed myself in the classes where the educator actively said, don't believe everything that I'm saying, like actually think critically, and then gave us the tools to do that. And that's the kind of educational experience that happens in a community school. So when it comes to SWOT, you do your strengths, you go through what is great in the school or in the program, and they do this both like on a macro level and on a micro level, and there's this proactive actually trying to find ways to do better, because if at least I can't do it now, then I can do it next year. But it also is a space for educators to like discuss with admin, like I could have done this better had I gotten better funding for it, or I could have done a history lesson better had we gone to the museum that we didn't have funds for. And it's small like advocacy things like that. SWATs aren't always being done to say, hey, we need to completely overhaul the educational system. It's because we do know we need that. But it is that idea of like, these small learning experiences can be strengthened, especially as we continue to evolve. Organizing and advocacy is going to look different 5 years from now than it does today. So doing SWATs is like a tool to grow, especially in a system that's always like, this is the way it's done and this is how it should be. So yeah, those are SWATs. I love them.
What are some of the next steps of community schools at UCLA and in California, if you don't mind sharing?
When it comes to California, we have this historic, the largest ever in history education spending being done right now. And that's where like CTA is really working with school sites, local associations, teachers unions, to really be the ones to not necessarily start the conversation, but make sure that it's being done right. Like, especially now, unions have a bad like rep because there's like, oh, there's just social justice, and we think about COVID, right? Teachers just don't want to go back to school. They're lazy. Like the media portrayed this idea. When at the end of the day, we're like the first ones there, right? We're with your students, your kids, almost more than you are, because they're at school for 7 to 8 hours a day while you're at work or just at home. So when we think about that, right, we also have to recognize that educators aren't just babysitters, right? They are actual workers with workplace rights. And that's where unions come in and actually empower these workers, these educators, to take a hold of their educational experience as well. So what CTA and NEA are really doing is making sure that educators know that they have a voice in this process of turning your school into a community school. But not only should they be included, they should also be leading it with the community, because they're part of the community. And elections, right? That is a lot of the work that's going to be done by NEA, CTA, and all that stuff. And it's not for Democrats. Let's get that out of the way. It's for pro-public education candidates, because it is pro-public education candidates that got us in California $4 billion for community schools. It is pro-public education candidates that got us the American Rescue Plan to help revive education spending. Because I have my critiques of that, of the whole whatever, blue, red, and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's who's actually going to lead the work and vote to support public education, right?
Is pro-public education in California a bipartisan thing?
That is a great question. And I think it is a bipartisan thing, not just in California, but also across the country. I think the problem is that it becomes so polarized because of extremist values and ideologies that really just kind of twist up the conversation. And yeah, honestly, I don't know why it would be a partisan issue, right? Why should education be a partisan issue when all of our students, regardless of political opinions, are going to the same educational qualities, our educational institutions? And that's where I say community schools are really great, because if community schools are supposed to be centers for democracy, then these are places where students and parents and families can come together to really talk about issues, right? If an educator, or if a parent doesn't like a lesson that an educator like discuss, then we can come in a community space to discuss it and grow from it, not point fingers and get upset, right?
That polarization that bleeds into schools is my only red flag with community schools, because you have groups such as Parents' Right in Education organization, which come together with their fearful beliefs that LGBTQ plus educators and conversations are going to harm children. Although community schools are empowering locals to stand up for what they believe, in a situation like this, where communities' beliefs made it all the way to the state level, where now policy is backing the criminalization of queer and non-binary educators and students, which further perpetuates the negative stigma, when community beliefs put others in danger, how do you think or hope that the NEA steps in to protect communities when there is an obvious lack of education in that community's beliefs?
So it can be on the record. I'm just going to say first, these are just like my values. I can't speak on behalf of the NEA, but this is what I think they should do, right? It starts with the conversation that conversations about social and racial justice and so forth, inclusivity, all this stuff, they're tough, right? They're difficult to have, especially in communities where folks don't recognize their privilege or their experiences and how it compares to others, and how they perhaps may have perpetuated some of the inequities that we see in society today, right? And if not them, then their ancestors and those before them, right? So when it comes to when you have radical ideas in a community school, so to say, and this is a conversation that I had with a close friend of mine, because they were asked a question like, why can't we have more religion in school, right? And he brought up the perfect example of like, I don't want that, but that's why you have a community school, where you bring folks together to have that conversation with those shared values or shared experiences. And it isn't this idea of now you're creating cliques, right? It's this idea of, okay, now we acknowledge that we have two different groups of people, let's grow together. And that's where community schools are great, because they're not just centers for you to go learn, they're centers for you to congregate, discuss, and learn, right? And if there's those differences, right, that's where conflict mediation comes in. That's where those services would then be something that the school identifies that they need to provide. How do we then bring communities together to have these kind of conversations, right? So what can like NEA and CTA do is empower educators to educate them on how to lead and teach with a social and racial justice lens, right? But then at the same time, being armed with the tools to deal with these kind of difficulties in regards to what can be done through the purview of the law, but also within their local associations, right? Because it's really easy for us to say one thing, but it's going to be different in another school district. It's going to be different in another state. So it's really empowering local associations to then take the proper and necessary steps. Because just like in every community school, every situation like that would be different, right? But it's going to be the unions and the communities that will be able to actually lead and then facilitate that situation, right? Because every situation is going to be different. Every one of those schools is going to be different. And that's why there isn't a set template to constructing and creating community schools, right? It's just a lot of conversation.
And although the government does have to evaluate and take ownership of the policies being passed, government energy is honestly gonna follow the money. Whatever we vote to invest in will determine the amount of attention it receives. We know that you have a surprise for us in regards to government spending. Do you want to share that with us now?
Yeah.
If you're listening in on this episode on a phone, tablet, or computer, you can watch Jonathan walk us through this activity on our YouTube channel, Center for Holistic Teaching and Learning, which is also outlined in the description.
So I wanted to just kind of talk about school funding momentarily, because I know that one thing about community schools is they're super expensive. And one thing that I wanted you to uplift in the podcast, because of just like when we talk about being able to get access to this holistic method of teaching, right, and learning, being in a community school, a lot of folks are going to argue that there's not a lot of funds for it, right? But In reality, it's just about smart spending, right? So that's where I invite everyone to, when you're bored or just have a free minute or two, go to spenditonschools.org. Again, it's spenditонschools.org, where it's kind of a game. It's a fun game where you get to look at the ways that America decides to fund things and how it could be used for public education. And when you go through it and play through it, I'm going to choose like my favorite ones to just like go into, like cut their budgets, so to say, and how that could be done better for education. You'll see that there's going to be all this extra money to fund community schools, right? So we have 123 billion for police spending. You have private, if you get rid of the 3.9 billion for private prisons, the 985 million for police and schools, actually tax the richest, which would raise American federal revenue by 126 billion, and got rid of ICE detention facilities. And then we thank God for the CARES Act, right? And the American Rescue Act. And we actually do estate taxes correctly, as well as correctly spending on our facility. You go to the next step, it will show you that you have, right now we have 378 million dollars, right? And you go into this next step and it shows how do you want to spend it, right? You could spend all of it to pay teachers more and still do smaller class sizes. We can improve teacher quality by investing in their education, also providing free after school programs, more community school coordinators. Let's try and fix the digital divide, right? Art programs, full day kindergarten, free summer lessons, also getting bonuses for teachers, like a nurse in every school, repair and update school buildings. Now we're finally in the negatives, right? But we can continue going in debt, right? And go fulfill the promise of IDEA, expand on restorative justice, free preschool, fully fund Title I, recruit and retain teachers of color, get more counselors, expand ethnic studies, all this stuff. Go to this website, y'all, and check it out. But we're out of money, so to say, on this, but this doesn't include like California's $4 billion. It doesn't include all of the other money that was just passed, right, at the state level. So that's where I say, like, this is not a dream. This idea that I envisioned in high school is not a dream, because the funds are there. It's just a matter of how do we properly invest in it, right? And we see that if we actually spent a lot of the money that we saw back here in the first step on school stuff, right? Like if we just tried in abolishing the school to prison pipeline, if we didn't do that, we wouldn't have to spend 3.9 billion on private prisons or 81.9 billion in prisons in general. We could just spend it on schools, right? And not have to deal with this incarceration problem. But we choose to perpetuate it through policy, and that's why we're stuck here. So that's why I say we can do this. It's not a dream. It's something that can become a reality. It's just about voting. And that's where I just go back. Elections matter, because it's not just about the policies or like the one issue items that come up every 4 years, right? It's the fact that education spending and policy done 1 year affects policy for years to come. And that's where we find ourselves now, where our education system is poorly funded, operating kind of on fumes, but we have all these other areas where we're just making people richer, right? And not tending to the students' needs. So I just wanted to uplift this because, like I said before, it's not a dream. It's a reality that we can see in our lifetimes. It's just about voting and making sure that we're spending correctly and holding our elected officials accountable to that.
I would like to interview you again in 2 or 3 years. After you've had more experience in schools. And I love your idealism. And at the same time, the one catch in this whole thing that I'm seeing is, yes, bottom up is important, but who's at the bottom and how their voices get heard and how that's facilitated. Even if you have a lot of trust in EA colleagues and things, there's so many of us who have been, our biases, our conditioning, all that, we need to look at it.
Right.
We get into facilitating sometimes, and we haven't even experienced alternative forms of education that are really creative and innovative.
Right.
So we end up recreating something without even realizing what the alternatives are. On that note, I would also, because you are such a bright young man, I want to encourage you to read a certain book. I just read it, and it was fascinating because, and you already know this, but it's called The Future of Smart, but it looks at education in a systemic way. Have you already read it, maybe? I don't know.
No, I'm writing it down right now.
Okay, yeah. I interviewed the author a few weeks ago, and I'm just amazed at what she's doing with funders and trying to educate people who fund education about understanding this big systemic changes that need to happen so that really more creative approaches that really give students voice and create a framework that's not based on the old testing system and how we had to move into that. And sometimes those conversations that you keep talking about, they are so important. And how do we educate ourselves to move into those conversations so that we're giving real different options for how we're structuring our schools?
Right.
Because I think in the next few years, as you get into working in schools some more, you'll see more of the, it's not just systemic racism, it's systemic old mindset of very entrenched Descartesian ways of seeing the world. And overcoming that is, I think we can. I agree to be hopeful, but there's a lot embedded in how each of us as individuals need to change to meet that challenge.
Right, definitely. No, definitely in agreement.
But yeah, I've really enjoyed this, just listening to all your knowledge and how you're putting it all together and seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, and thank you all for this opportunity, because Julissa reached out and I was like, wait, when did I do this again? Because I was like, summer is so long now. And then I was like, oh, I remember her. And then bumped into a colleague of mine. And I was like, oh, yeah, by the way, I'm doing this podcast thing that Julissa reached out to. And for me, it was like, I get to talk to another aspiring educator about community schools. Also just like educating and like bringing it up, because I found a lot of people are still hearing about it for the first time. And like, I only found out about it because I'm crazy, I like to say. And I just happened to be in the right spot at the right time. But yeah, so it's definitely, I'm really, really like grateful for this opportunity. I really hope that, y'all were able to take away something from it. And I'm also just, glad for your insight, Robin, and appreciate kind of the work that you all are doing. And just broadening the conversation and also looking to do something better for our kiddos, right?
We are so grateful that we had a moment to speak with you today, and California is so lucky to have you on their team. I mean, you all are pioneering something that matters and will change lives. If you don't mind telling us, what are some of your goals for the near future?
Yeah, so I just want to go back on something you said, Julissa. You said pioneering. I'm not a pioneer. I am just standing on the shoulders of giants who really started this work. And now I'm just happy that my crazy thought had a name, and the whole theories and all that stuff already done, right? But with that in mind, my goal right now actually is hopefully next January, I'll be starting my research experience in a community school, because part of the major here at UCLA is where you have to actually go into the classroom, research and experience being in a classroom of some sort. And one option you can choose is a community school. And I'm like, I want to be there. I don't want to be anywhere else, because I do want to work in a community school, like straight off the bat of getting my degree and my certifications, because I mean, I love them, right? I'm a little biased towards them. And with that in mind, I'm really hoping that within the next few years, like my goal is to continue talking about community schools with aspiring educators, with the idea that you're going to a school site that actually empowers you and cares about you, and where you can take agency in your job, right? You're not just going with the motions of the curriculum that's provided to you by the state. You can actually take advantage of the passion that you have for teaching and do it your way. Teach the lesson the way that you want to do it, or the way that the students want to do it, or the way that's going to benefit the students the most. Because we all go through our teacher ed programs and learn about the different modes of learning and all that. But then when you finally get in the classroom, you're like, oh crap, this is not what I was expecting. And for me, it's advocating for aspiring educators to know that community schools exist, so that their first day of teaching, they feel welcomed in a space where they can make mistakes, so that they can then ask questions and grow. And that goes to our current state of the world of America, of the world of education in America, where we have largest teacher shortage and the largest teacher exodus that we've seen ever in history. And that starts with the fact that teachers just don't feel valued or heard in their school site. And for me, it's making sure aspiring educators are aware of community schools, so that they, when they enter the education profession, they want to stay there, not just as educators, but as leaders moving that change, moving the conversation for higher teacher pay, for more workers' respect, because it's a lot of the problems that we see in education, or that are affecting the education workforce, are perpetuated by the state of it itself. When it comes to CTA and NEA, it's definitely also continuing that conversation. The conversation around community schools has expanded from small, I wouldn't say small because there were several states involved, but like that smaller institute, it has now expanded to now small focus groups. It has now expanded to entire conference strands, focusing just on community schools to better educate union leaders, union education leaders, on what are community schools and how can you participate, right? How can you become a community school? And it's that focus work that's really going to be like the driving force in making sure that schools are being happy, because it's that first conversation. A lot of things around organizing as a young organizer, learning organizer, is it's the starting point. You have the idea, but now it's the steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when it comes to community schools, there's like, I don't know how many hundreds, if any, but each one costs something, right? And that's where, you know, having the right conversations and being in the right places and being trained to really be like a great negotiator and bargainer on your bargaining team is what's going to help community schools and locals really drive that change. So when it comes to, in general, what are the goals? It's to just make folks aware that these like centers for social transformation really do exist, that these places can be places for communities to thrive and really battle the systemic racism, systemic poverty that we see affecting communities across America, that we as a nation finally decided that we needed to address. And yeah, and that's why community schools are amazing, y'all. I always end with that, those like 3-4 words, and that's why community schools are amazing, because they really are places for social transformation, for things to just change, either just at the local level or starting to then expand to elsewhere, right? So yeah.
Thank you. Love that. And that's why community schools are amazing. That's an initiative I'll be adopting soon.
It's like sometimes I feel like I write out a whole, like when I like speak, I write out like a whole paragraph, and then my conclusion sentence, they tell you, I remember English teachers always saying it has to be that impactful statement, right? To leave your members. And I'm like, I'm not going to do a long one. I'm just going to say it as it is, because it is amazing.
Yeah, agreed. 100%. Do you have any other announcements? I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about midterm elections and some things that we should be keeping an eye out for.
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of like what we talked about earlier, like when we talked about the school funding and how government is, you know, in charge of all this funds, right? It's about spending them correctly though, right? And that's where it really kind of it really emphasize like the importance of elections, especially with midterm elections. A lot of what like we see in politics is heavy polarization, right? Really, really like helped by the media and all that. And at the end of the day, at least this is how I see it, the media doesn't care about the average working person. And I see that because it's just the same thing, it's the same polarization over and over again, when it's like, Why don't we talk about the fact that, like, I'm an aspiring educator living paycheck to paycheck in one of the most expensive cities in America just because I want to be a teacher. And you know, like, it's just like, and I don't mind that the media is not talking about that, but the reality is the majority of people don't sit down to watch the news. They're living lives or doing things because they need to live. And that's where, when we go to think about midterms and all this stuff, the polarization really doesn't do well when it comes to actually electing pro-public education candidates. There's a lot of perspective that Democrats are the only pro-public ed candidates, but there are actually Republican candidates who vote yes on every education bill that comes onto the floor. Why? Because they're pro-pub ed. They see the value in public education, right? Then you have folks who would come in and they're trying to privatize it. There's trying to institute voucher schemes or influencing like school choice and making that a thing with public funds. That's where we start raising our flags, right? That's where we really need to be advocating, organizing to ensure that we're not electing those folks, because at the end of the day, they might have a stance on, let's say, abortion or critical race theory or whatnot. But at the end of the day, is what are they going to do that's going to benefit public ed? And for me, because every aspect of elections affects education, the school board determines your pay rate. Your classroom sizes are determined by your school board. So your school board election matters. It's not just the president that matters, y'all. Vote for your school board. Vote for your state city council members. Because that, like, and I told the same thing to my mom, because my mom, she was like, I don't want to vote for Hillary. I don't want to vote for Trump. I told her, look into the school board elections. If you're going to go turn in an empty ballot, at least fill in those ones, because those ones do matter. We put school board members into office that have never spent a day in a classroom and don't know what the teachers need. When a teacher is making an average of $60,000 a year in California, and that school board member is making upwards of 130, and they just sit at a desk all day. So that's where I mean, elections really do matter. Do your research. Don't just vote for your state senators or just the president. Really look up and down the ballot, because those are where decisions are made in education. And that's where, again, I go to say pro-public ed candidates, because both, you could say Biden and Trump are both pro-public ed, but at the end of the day, they don't do too much when it comes to influencing education spending. It's the legislature, because they're the hold the money of the purse, like power of the purse. But then even then, it goes then further down to the states and the local governments to then make more education decisions. So really just don't overshadow those elections. They really do matter, especially when it comes to you in where you specifically live.
What do you think California is doing that Oregon could really learn from right now?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the work that California is doing, at least like when I think of the conversation around community schools, is that California has a very diverse population of just in general, right? And what California, I think, has, I wouldn't say has done, or it's just the opportunity that California, I guess, gave, is just the space to organize, right? Where communities were able to find folks to mobilize around. So I think like Cesar Chavez and the Chicano movement down here in Southern California. And then we look now at the present day, like United Farm Workers marched up the entire Central Valley to Sacramento, and they were able to organize thousands of people just to make sure that farm workers can unionize, right? And it's the idea that there's this vast population of diverse folks who all feel a different way, but understand that they're all being oppressed, right? And it was that local kind of grassroots organizing that then started this conversation around community schools. So if Oregon hasn't done that grassroots organizing, right, then I think that's like probably one of the first steps that needs to happen, right? Of community members coming together to really discuss what needs to be done. And it doesn't take, like, so to say, prominent figure, right? You don't need some moment in history, person in history, like superhero to do it. It takes just a community, right? Let's organize, let's have a conversation, and then let's elevate this to the next level, right? Because at the end of the day, our government is here to serve us, right? And that's where we go and voice our concerns, elevate our concerns, organize, create a union, or create a organization that's working to amplify an issue, right? And yes, a lot of this stuff, you know, it sounds like, oh, it's a lot of work, it's not me. Like, it's just something I can't do on your own. You're right. It's not something you can do on your own. You need your community behind you, right? And that starts with the conversation. And that's the part that's always going to be scary, right? But having that conversation, and that's where, when I think of aspiring educators, that's important to have that conversation about community schools now, right? Before they even enter the classroom, because we enter the classroom with this idea of what we knew of, right? And then now we actually enter it, and then we are like, yeah, this is the same system of school that I was bored of when I was actually the student, right? And that's where I go back and think of, like, why do I want to work in a community school immediately? It's because working in a space where you actually feel welcomed, appreciated, right, is going to be what really drives aspiring educators to then work in a community school. And if not, then being the person to start the conversation that nobody wants to start because it's so hard, right? But when you discuss and highlight the value of community schools, not just for the students in the community, but for the educators themselves, that's where you're able to then spark that passion, right? And maybe spark that change in that community. Using a lot of the resources that both the government and like unions may have to offer to get that conversation started. I mean, we have a large education budget because that's just the size of our state. 1 in 5 students in America, or no, I think it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 9. Don't quote me, but one of those students goes to school in California, right? And with that, there's like a large budget, right? But because we need to fund that, but money is only one thing. It's about actually then executing it correctly, right? Using it correctly. And that's where really educating voters to that digging of, what is my representative actually going to do, not just what do they think? Because then at that point, we're able to then actually vote in pro-public ed or smart policies, right? Vote for bills or whatnot. In California, we call them propositions that would benefit communities. So I think those are some next steps that Oregon could take that California has done. It's primarily, working with grassroots conversation, but also that grassroots movement, if it hasn't already begun. And if it has begun, then really organizing to make sure that community schools happen through policy, but also community action and community organization. So then that way the community's voices can be elevated and centered around the community schools.
Off the record, I think the two of you should stay in touch because you're both leaders of the future in your states.
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely.
Jonathan Oyaga and community schools bring hope for the future of public education. My biggest takeaways are the notion of love, teaching with and about love at the core of learning, the importance of giving teachers, students, and families the power to catalyze change in their community, and a reminder that voting on all levels is necessary to see true change. If you'd like to see what's going on in your state's education association, you can visit the National Education Association website at nea.org. Here you can become a member and find ways to make change happen. Make sure to check out the Center for Holistic Education's website and keep an eye out for our upcoming event, the HTLC Adventure, where we will be hosting an open house on October 24th at Southern Oregon University to showcase all of our cool projects. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.